And the archaeology itself, and remember, the archaeology just refers to those first 20 or so paragraphs of the opening of the text. But it's those questions, the difference between barbarism and Greekness, and then the difference between Athens and Sparta, that the archaeology itself is going to clarify for us, presumably. And so that's what we have in mind as we go into the second paragraph now. And so beginning, Thucydides says the following: evident that long ago what is now called Hellas had no stable settlements. Instead, there were various migrations in these early times. Each group readily abandoned their own territory whenever forced to do so by those with superior numbers. For there was no commerce, and people were insecure about making contact with each other, either by land or sea, so that each lived off their own land, just at the subsistence level, and neither produced any surplus goods nor planted the ground, since they had no walls and never knew when some invader might come and rob them. They took the view that they could secure their daily needs for sustenance anywhere, and so they were not concerned about uprooting and moving on, with the consequences that they had no cities of any size or other general resources to make them strong. It was always the finest land that was most subject to changes of population, namely what is now called Thessaly, Boeotia, most of the Peloponnese, excluding Arcadia, and the best parts elsewhere. And the quality of the land gave some groups more power than others, and that led to internal conflict. Now, the Greek word that's used there is stasis, and so we need to keep in mind that's the exact same word that gets used in the opening paragraph, where war quickly was transformed into this thing called stasis, a much broader category, motion. What Thucydides has just told us is that at the most basic level of property, land, there's an associated quest for power, and it's that associated quest for power that leads to stasis, motion. And continuing, he says it's that motion that destroyed them and at the same time encouraged outsiders to have designs on them. Attica, at any rate, has been free of such strife from the earliest times on account of its poor soil, and it's always been inhabited by the same people. This is a good illustration of my argument that it was because of relocations that other places did not develop in the same way as Attica. For the most powerful figures from other parts of Greece who were driven out either by war or internal conflict, stasis, motion, resorted to the safety of Athens, and by becoming citizens right from the very earliest times, they so increased the city's population that Attica could not contain them, and the Athenians later sent out colonies to occupy Ionia as well. All right, and that is the second paragraph of the text. And just let me remind you, I've done an entire discussion just on teasing out everything that comes tumbling from a close examination of that paragraph. And again, that's on my Athens Corner website. But since we're just catching up here, I'll mention just a few of the important things that are involved in that paragraph. Notice the way he ends that paragraph. He says, "This is a good illustration of my argument." Okay, pause. What's his argument? In the rest of that sentence, he says that it was because of the relocations that other places did not develop in the same way as Attica. So we ask ourselves, wait a minute, where did he make that argument? And when you look back at the opening of the paragraph, it's right there. He said it's evident that long ago what is now called Hellas had no stable settlements. In other words, what's called Hellas didn't exist. It's only now called Hellas. And continuing that sentence, he says, instead, in other words, instead of a stable Hellas, which means any Hellas, there were various migrations in these early times. And so this is a perfect example of what we could call the matchstick theory of reading. Find a little piece here, and then you find a little piece there, and then you rub them together, and it bursts out into a flame. And in our case here, what we see is that what Thucydides is calling his argument is that from the earliest times, there was no stability. There was only motions in terms of migrations, groups of people, wandering, roaming, nothing stable, a kind of fundamental flux. And he's very explicit. He tells us what the reason is for this instability, this flux, these motions. The first is superior numbers. And what that means is what is now called Hellas was populated by small groups of people, none of whom were committed to any particular land or area because they would simply flee whenever they were outnumbered. And because of this, there was no commerce, no trade. He says people were flatly afraid of contact with each other, either by land or sea. And the consequence of this is that people only lived at the level of daily subsistence, producing no surplus, and so no plans for the future, and certainly no agriculture, no planting of the ground, because it's precisely the ground that they were going to flee whenever outnumbered. And so they certainly didn't have any walls, no defenses against these larger groups of people, of whom they never know when they would be attacked. No planning, no thought whatsoever about the future except fleeing. And so what we have in all of this from Thucydides is something like the following kind of a checklist. The earliest times of what they now call Hellas, which previously was nothing but small groups of people who would always just flee whenever they were outnumbered, is definitively characterized by war, unrest, motion, poverty because of no commerce, and outright injustice. And so the antitheses of these characteristics are peace, rest, wealth, or justice,